This week, we're talking with Gina Mueller, who has served as a pastor, led national disciple-making ministry, and is Viennese, or Vision New England's, disciple-making catalyst. And we'll be talking about her spiritual life, so we know what one looks like, why it's important, get some ideas for our own spiritual lives, and talk about some things Gina is doing to help people in this space. I'm Charles Galda, your host for The Church in Action. Gina, thanks for being with us again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so for folks you've been a repeat guest, but for folks who may not have heard those episodes, can you give us a little bit of bio and what you do at Vision New England?
Sure. Quick synopsis. My family and I live in Southern Maine. My husband and I have been married 21 years. We've got two kids, 17 and 19. Have been in ministry over 20 years. So I've led in big church, planted a church, multiplied a network of micro churches, led a ministry called 3DM. So I've been working with alongside churches for a long time and helping them create a discipling culture that produces healthy missional disciples that multiply. And then now on the team with Vision New England as the disciple-making catalyst.
And we'll talk a little bit more about some upcoming things related to that. But before we do that, let's talk about your spiritual life. And not because we want, this is an inquisition, but because we want to share the information so folks can learn from each other. Very few of us lay people are ever in conversations about spiritual practices. So it's really helpful. And so, but let's start by just defining what is a spiritual life?
Yeah. So I think about, I love the term spiritual practices. It helps me think in terms of what are the regular rhythms or habits that we have that help us become more and more like Jesus over time. So it's, again, practices, habits, rhythms that shape us, form us, connect us to the heart of the Father. And I like to use the language of these are things that help us reorient our lives around the life and way of Jesus. And what I love about this conversation and talking about different habits and practices is it helps me think about how we're actually connected to believers all over the world through these kinds of things and all throughout history. So if you think about all throughout history, tracing all the way back to the time of Jesus, there is different habits and rhythms and practices that the people of God have been doing to really tend to how do we get closer to God? How do we learn how to hear his voice? How do we grow in community? All of those things.
Because it does, when we use the phrase spiritual life, it does almost suggest it's this separate thing over here.
Yeah.
As opposed to, it's really about my life.
Whole life integrated into, it's not compartmentalized into something, 20 minutes a day. It's really something that forms our whole life. Yeah.
And so help me with a term, because this is part of a series. And one of the other episodes we're talking about, we're landing on that the quiet time is not the most helpful phrase in the world. But we don't have a better one. And so do you have a better term we can use for devotional time, whatever what we should be calling it? Sanctification time sounds a little bit too.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to find language because even if you say, sometimes I talk about my time with God, but here's even the downfall of that is that then we assume that we have this time with God and the rest of my day is not.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that we'll talk more about that. One of my favorite books that I read a long time ago was by a guy named Brother Lawrence, who talks about, the very normal everyday things that we do down to washing dishes are spiritual. And so it's hard to find language that's actually helpful for devotional time with God, quiet time. And the reality is, I talk to a lot of young moms and they're like, quiet time? What is that? I don't even know what is quiet anymore, but yeah.
And because our goal is we really want a life. I know you would say this, but you'd say it in different words. I want to give you a chance to put it in your words because they'll be better than mine. But we really want a life in this ongoing dialogue and presence of God.
Yes.
This set aside time over here is contrary to that. Give us better words for that, maybe.
Yeah, I talk about, whole life discipleship that, and we started talking about these spiritual practices, that there's rhythms that we put in place that form our whole life. And so what it ends up doing is it's not just helping me as an individual connect to God personally, but it's actually, it's helping me lean much more into community. It's helping me form a lifestyle of mission and all of those things. So whole life discipleship means that my whole life, including my schedule, how I use my house, my resources, we talk about the output of things like generosity and things like that, but the practical nature of that comes down to things like how I use my stuff, and my house and all of those things. And so when we talk about whole life discipleship, it gets really practical like that.
Yeah, and the risk is for a lot of us, even what you just said, we compartmentalize that. So my house, that's another compartment, right?
Yeah.
My schedule, there's another compartment. We don't know how to break down the compartments.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us a little about, give us some insights into your own spiritual life. What are the rhythms, the practices? What's daily versus weekly? How do you think about it?
Yeah. So first I would say, I'll get into that, but one of the things that's helpful for me to even think about as we're getting into this conversation is I feel like so often when we start talking about spiritual practices or rhythms, we come at it from an individualistic kind of mindset. So when we read scripture and we start talking about spiritual practices, we are thinking this is an individual exercise that's helping me get closer to God. And
My
I think
quiet
sometimes,
time, right?
Yes. And I think sometimes we miss the communal nature of scripture, and that so many spiritual practices were actually experienced in community. And so, there's so much about our life with God. Yes, things like scripture reading and prayer and learning to hear God's voice and growing in our faith and courage to actually do something with what he's inviting us into. There is an individual journey in that, but I think sometimes we miss the communal nature. So, when it comes to my own spiritual practices, these are things that have changed throughout the seasons of my life. So when I had our kids are 17 and 19 now, when we had really small children, my spiritual rhythms and practices had to look different, or in my singleness, they looked different. So these are practices that have changed over time. And I give myself freedom and permission to allow for that because of what you were talking about, that it's really about a relational connection with God. So they have changed throughout seasons, but I also actually find that they change throughout the seasons of the year. So for example, spiritual practices, I am leaning into, daily time with God. For me, it's helpful to do that in the morning because my brain is sharpest. In the morning, I personally am a part of a discipleship group every week. And so that's both for spiritual growth, but also for accountability. So this is a group that's different than a Bible study or a small group. These are people that have permission to speak both life and truth to me. For a lot of years, I did a 6 a.m. prayer call with other people on the phone for 30 minutes every morning, Monday through Friday. And that's not something that I'm doing in this season, but I did that for a lot of years, and that was really, really formative. Sabbath is something that I have learned how to do in the last handful of years. A lot to say about that. Aim for Sabbath weekly. I would also put things like missional rhythms. I would call those spiritual practices. So for our family, we're always asking in each season, who is the Lord sending us to? What relationships or network of relationships with our friends or our neighbors who aren't following Jesus yet? Who is God inviting us to really kind of lean into those relationships and spend time with? And depending on who that is, that then shapes the kind of missional rhythms that we have. So in some seasons, that's led to like a weekly, we call it open table. In other seasons, it's led to other things. One of my favorite things is I have found my prayer life to become much more robust. Or should I say it focus better when I'm walking? Like when my feet are moving, when my body is moving, I can connect with God much easier and stay more focused. So one of the practices that I do especially as it starts getting nicer outside, is at least a few times a week, I'll walk my neighborhood and I'm praying for my neighbors and things like that. I've also found over the years, as I've kind of asked the questions of how do I connect with God best, creation is thin space for me. And so whether it's like finding beautiful places to walk that are close to me, I love the woods. We have a river behind our house, so I'll kayak. And that's just thin space for me to connect with God. But in terms of like rhythms, this might sound weird, but I try to get to the mountains on like some kind of rhythm. I try to get to the mountains because there's something about the mountains where I connect with God on a real close level. So
define for us what you mean by thin space.
Yeah. So by thin space, I mean that it is like the presence of God is there. And it is not, I'm not reaching for it. I'm not struggling to connect with God. It's like there's something about that space where God's presence meets me in just a real tangible way.
So we experience the presence of God differently than we might at other times.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so now you hit on a whole bunch of different practices. Yeah. So you talked about the missional stuff, and you talked about sometimes that looks like an open table. What do you mean by that? It sounds to me like you're saying be intentional about reaching out to others and including others. But what do you mean?
Yeah. So one of the kind of practices that we have really leaned into over the last maybe 15 years or so is we're very much paying attention to who are the people of peace in our life. Comes from John 10, where we're looking for people who aren't yet following Jesus, but they're open to us, they're open to relationship with us, and they might be open to Jesus. And so we're looking for those people in all the different spaces of our life. So that could be, our kids at school, it could be in our neighborhood, all the different places and spaces that our lives already are in our very normal everyday life. We're looking for those people. And then what we have found is that it is really helpful to have a predictable pattern where we can connect with those people or invite them closer in with us. So I'll kind of tell a story that gives an example. So when we moved into this house 4.5 years ago or so, my daughter was a sophomore in high school. And so she, as the new kid going into high school, she's learning all of their names, asking curious questions about their stories, high fives down the hallway. And she would come home and process who she met that day and what she's learning about their life stories. And one of the things that she was noticing as kind of a pattern is that in this particular high school, there was a lot of kids that had really hard family stories. And so she's like, Mom, what can we don't have a perfect family, but we do have a pretty good one. Is there some way that we can lean into relationship? What does that look like? How can we offer, a sense of family? So as we're brainstorming together, she's like, could we invite them over for dinner once a week? Yes, absolutely we can. And so we create a regular pattern, a predictable pattern, a regular rhythm in our house that we called Open Table. And so she knew that she could invite anyone from school. She was really looking for students who were open to her that might be open to Jesus. And so once a week, we had a predictable pattern of Open Table in our house. And she knew that, she could invite any of those kids over. And something like an Open Table gives space over time to really get to know people. A one-off kind of thing is great when you're kind of starting to build relationship, but when you're wanting to really build consistency and be present with people, having some kind of predictable pattern for that is really helpful. So we found something like an Open Table to be a really helpful rhythm We did it in a season weekly. We've got other friends right now that are doing it once a month with their neighbors.
And so you're doing it every Thursday then, and
Sure.
she knows that she can invite them. And my guess is some people then come once or twice and you don't see them again. And eventually some become regulars over time and they're there every week. And now you're building a deeper relationship.
Yeah. And the kinds of conversations that happen around food and around a table and sitting on the floor in our living room over time, as we're, inviting them, we're moving into their life and they're moving into ours, is pretty special.
And they just happen, or you are intentional about making them happen?
Both. So you never want to force it, right? We're not doing a weird kind of bait and switch, trying to, lure people into our house and then, drop on them
spiritual laws.
Yes, that's weird. So for us, we are always authentically ourselves. And so we're looking for ways to be good news people. And that means I firmly believe that good news is both felt and heard. And so, Jesus says, heal the sick and tell them the good news. And so there's something about practically good news being felt. And so we're real intentional with that. But here's the thing, as people, what we're talking about is being good friends. So how are we being good friends to people, but being super authentic in our relationships and who we are? So, as we're asking curious questions about their lives and their families, and they're trusting us more and more, and we're sharing more of our vulnerabilities, that's really important too. So the reality is we are just as desperate for Jesus to show up in real ways for us. And so, we're sharing our own vulnerabilities. And so over time, spiritual conversations naturally happen as they're getting to know the real us and we're getting to know the real them. And there's kind of opportunities for that, but we're not being weird trying to force things. And so some nights we're just hanging out and it's just food and there's not sort of spiritual fireworks that are going off, but being good friends in relationship with people over time, authentically sharing our lives with them, spiritual conversations happen.
Now what would you say to somebody listening going, oh my gosh, every week and having conversations like you're talking about are not conversations we have normally, and I'm uncomfortable. Yeah. And how do you respond to me?
Yeah, so good. Okay. So what you should know about our family is that all four of us are introverts. And so we get a lot of questions, and I think a lot of people are like, whoa, that sounds like a lot. And so all four of us are introverts. And so that means, though we have learned over time, over the last 15 plus years, we have learned hospitality. We have learned how to use our home for both ministry and mission and all of those things. And I believe that those are spiritual practices that form us and shape our character in really deep ways. However, start with something. So you don't have to start with a weekly rhythm. And I would even say in New England, I would leverage spring and summer to start with something, and start with something outside. They don't even have to come in your house. Maybe have a bonfire. Maybe have an ice cream social in your driveway, whatever that is. But, you don't have to start with a weekly rhythm for us. And I would also say that it depends on who you're trying to reach and who those relationships are. And, more to say on that, but
some will feel more natural for some of us, but what I'm hearing is just do something, right?
Yeah.
Don't
take
let
a step.
The perfect be the enemy of the good. Do something.
So true. Yes. Yep.
And so, but what you're talking about is radically different than most of us are living. And so what's missing in our theology or our practices or our church upbringing, if you will, what's missing that that we're not, that sounds so foreign to so many of us?
Yeah. I think I go back to some of what we were talking about earlier, where I think that we've been given a picture of following Jesus that is very individualistic and it's private.
Mm.
rather than something that is experienced in community and includes missional, both communal and missional. So I would even say things like rhythms of prayer are not just individual, they can also be communal and missional. Even Sabbath, when we think about rhythms of Sabbath, they can be communal and missional. But oftentimes we start with thinking about me and how am I going to do that pattern or rhythm or practice. And we theologically, we have missed the communal nature and the missional nature of the gospel.
And many of these practices are much harder to do by ourselves.
Aren't
Right?
they?
We've talked before where, prayer especially, and
fasting. Nobody likes fasting, but I'm much more, let's be real, but I'm much more willing to take a step and actually try that if I'm doing it with other people.
Yeah. And, when we say when a kid says, I'm bad in math, I need help, we don't say, well, figure it out on your own. And if I'm bad at track and field, we don't say, figure it out on your own. But somehow in our spiritual life, we're just kind of like, figure it out on your own. We've got sermons and go find stuff.
Mm-hmm. So true.
And so have you found some resources that are actually helpful for folks who may not have somebody communal, they may not have the communal thing or not ready to take that step? Or are there some things that you say, hey, here's some places or some books that might be helpful in exploring this?
So some of my favorites in terms of like when I'm spending time with God, and maybe these are just growing how I'm spending time with God. Some of my favorites, I personally use the Moravian text. I love the Moravians. They were built on a prayer movement, a bunch of missionaries. So I get an email every single morning that gives me a Psalm, a New Testament, and an Old Testament, and then a prayer kind of thing. So that's what I personally use. And I love that that's connecting me to other believers and missionaries across the world that are all reading the same thing every day. So that's one that I love. I love Lectio 365. There's an app by the 24/7 Prayer Movement. Love that one. My friend Bob Ronglian also has a devotional that's one of my favorite resources for really digging in contextually into the Gospels. So that's one of my favorites. There's another book that I'm thinking of that is about missional spiritual practices, and I can't think of what the title of the book is right now, but it's all leaning into spiritual formation or spiritual practices that don't remove us from mission, but actually help us lean into mission. And I love that one as well.
If you give that to McKenna, she can put it in the text on our Facebook page for it. Well, you mentioned a devotional by a friend. Where can folks find that?
Yeah, it's called Footsteps Every Day, and it's by Bob Ronglian. So we could put a link up for that one as well.
Thanks. Now let's shift gears a little bit from your own practices to what you're doing at Vision New England, because you've been on board now as our disciple making catalyst for 5 or 6 months, maybe.
Yeah.
So just share what in this conversation relates to what you're doing and what's coming up.
Okay. So I feel like this conversation is so important. I'm a visionary, so I love to think about what would happen if we really had followers of Jesus all across New England who were following Jesus in such a way with such intentionality that they truly were reorienting their lives around Jesus and his way. They really truly were living in deep community with others and building authentic friendships with their friends and neighbors who are far from God. That would fundamentally change New England, cities, towns, neighborhoods. And so we want to come alongside churches and everyday people to help them be and make healthy disciples that make more disciples. So we've got some opportunities in training and equipping kind of opportunities coming up for those who really want to lean into building a disciple-making culture, both in their churches and in their homes. So I want to talk about a couple different kind of categories. So for pastors and church leaders, we're going to be doing disciple-making leader labs, and those are like in-person workshop days that are investment days for pastors and their team. So a smaller church, a pastor might bring kind of their key lay leaders. Mid-sized to larger churches would bring, usually they're bringing staff, but a lot of churches in a room together. And these kind of workshop days are meant to help you slow down long enough to take stock, hear the Lord together, get vision, and refocus on making healthy disciples that make new disciples. So it's equipping around a specific topic that has to do with a disciple-making culture. And so we're going to give you kind of frameworks and tools that you can immediately contextualize into your specific context. So the first one is coming up at the end of May 30th, at Valley Community Church in Avon, Connecticut. And you'll be able to find more information and registration on the Make Disciples resource page, as well as the events page on the VNE website. And then I will say too, if you are connected to a network of churches and you want to explore hosting a leader lab, reach out to me. I would love to explore that together with you. So that's Disciple Making Leader Labs. We also run a 2-year learning community cohort for churches who really want to go on the journey of building a discipling culture in their church. So that's for churches. For everyday people or anyone who wants to learn how to make new disciples, we are testing. We're going to do some Disciple Maker digital workshops. And those are 90 minutes online. And each one is going to cover a different topic to help you be and make disciples in your everyday life. So we're going to start those. And we've got one already scheduled for April, one for May. That's information that you can find in the same spot.
Exciting. So visionnewengland.org/events, you can find everything you just talked about.
Yep.
And if folks have trouble finding something for some reason or have a question, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so all of my contact info is on the team page on the Vision New England website. So you can connect with me there. And then on the Make Disciples resource page, we'll have links to all of these things too from the VNE website.
Cool. Now, you mentioned what it would be like in New England if we actually lived the way Jesus lived, and what that would look like. Has revival, I know you're not a church historian, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but has revival and awakening ever happened absent that?
Say that a different way. In other words, we are not
strategies about evangelism and church growth and stuff like that. And I'm not meaning to dump on those, but I don't know that those have ever led to, or even this intentional effort, but let's change the culture through politics or something like that. Has it ever come about in any other way other than what you described?
No. And I will say there's a pattern that if you trace, so I have a master's degree in missional church movements. And I would say if you look at missional movements throughout history, movements are built on prayer and fasting. Period. You will always find that as a key foundational ingredient.
And I will give a quote I'm fond of using from James Allman, Dr. James Allman down at Dallas Seminary, that what God has done in the past is a model and a promise of what he will do in the future. But he's much too creative to do the same thing the same way twice. So it'll look different every time, but the pattern is prayer and fasting.
It is.
Right, which is about changing God's people first.
It is.
Right. Yeah. Gina, thanks so much. Thanks for your ministry. Thanks for being such a great person to work with. Thanks for the vision you have and the leadership you're providing in an area that's so critical, not just for New England, but the whole Western church, I think, is struggling with this as best we can tell. And I'm grateful to you for being with us at Vision New England and doing this.
Thanks. It's fun.
Thanks. Thanks. To support this program and accelerate evangelism, go to visionnewengland.org and click on Donate, or click Member to become a partner with us. This program is supported by the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.